Hello, spooky friends, and welcome to another episode of Pastatime with the Scariest Podcast.
Woo!
I'm Robin Grace. This is Adam Diaz.
Hello.
And today we're here to read you folks some creepypastas. That's what Pastatime is.
Yeah, so we're going to be doing actual creepypastas this episode. Previous time we did Pastatime, we did SCPs, which are always super fun. We're going to get back into the creepypasta roots of Pastatime, and we're going to be covering 4 stories tonight. I am going to be covering Lazy Saturday Night and World's Best Psychologist. Robin, what are you going to be covering?
I'm going to be covering, well, not covering, but I'm going to read No End House. I think the long ones should be like episodes on their own.
Yours is 9 pages on its own. My 2 combined are 9 pages. So this will be a decent length Pastatime, but hey, it's always fun to listen to some short story, fictional, creepy stuff, and I don't think anyone's going to complain. So we're going to go ahead and just jump right into the first one. I think I can go ahead and go first since you're still catching your breath.
Yeah, you do that.
Sounds good.
It's going to sound, I mean, it already sounds awful, but if I had to try and read right now, I'd be like, ooh, strap in for that one. Is this your long one?
It's my short one. All right, so the first story we're going to be reading tonight is called Lazy Saturday Night. And it starts out like this. By the way, I already have read this one all the way through. It has a nice twist at the end that I was like, oh shit. So it's pretty fun. All right, Lazy Saturday Night. Here I lay, all snuggled up in bed, warm and satisfied under the soft silk covers, watching some stupid documentary on TV I'd never heard of. I'd turn it over, but the gallon tub of cookie dough ice cream wouldn't let me use my hands for anything other than shoveling the frozen treat into my mouth. Nights like these are rare. It isn't often that everyone's out of the house but me, so I make sure to savor them. In fact, I wasn't expecting anyone back till the morning. That's what made the sound of the door opening downstairs so alarming. Panic hits me like a steam train. I silently leap out from under the covers, spilling the ice cream all over the pristine white carpet on the floor, and creak open the wardrobe next to the bed.
I would be real annoyed. White carpet is very hard to stay white.
Right?
Or to keep white, I guess.
I hear footsteps, heavy and indiscreet, like they want me to know they're here. I pant and pick up the spoon I had just been using to enjoy a relaxing night. The footsteps get louder. I force myself into the minuscule space remaining in the wardrobe and close the door, just as the stranger opens the bedroom door, not sparing any seconds for silence. I peer through the gap. His face looks familiar, but I can't place my finger on where I know him from. He spots the spilled ice cream and darts his head across the wide expanse of the bedroom. Hello? He calls, not sounding vicious, but I've made that mistake before. Never, under any circumstances, assume friendliness from a voice. He looks under the bed. Oh, crap, he's looking for someone. I hold back a whimper and start bending the bowl of the spoon back and forth, hoping to snap it off and create some way of defending myself. It snaps, but it creates a metallic click. The man turns his head around and makes his way to the wardrobe. I'm shaking now. Please don't open it. Please don't open it. Please don't open it. The door swings open and he sees me. We scream simultaneously in fear and surprise. Without hesitation, I leap onto the man and start digging into whatever stretch of flesh I can with the sharp edge of the spoon handle. He screeches in clear pain, but I won't stop. I hammer the handle deep into his chest and neck over and over till he becomes motionless. I've killed him. I cry in disgust and sprint downstairs away from the house. I charge down the road until I feel like I'm far enough away. I sit down for a moment and exhale heavily before regaining my composure. Pulling out my phone, I open Twitter and search #party. Hopefully this time I'll find a household that isn't lying when they say they'll be out all night.
That's fucked up.
Yup.
That's messed up.
When I was reading through this, I'm like, oh my God, but what if they know them? Like, what if this is their husband and they're just wearing different clothing? And then boom, it's not their fucking house.
When they both scream.
In surprise, it's like one of them is not, they're both not expecting the other person, right? But it's like one of them belongs there, the other one does. You know what I mean? It's just weird. Yeah. Solid writing. I really like that one. It's also very short, so nice way to start the show out, and hopefully, you enjoyed it.
Cool. All right, so I'm going to get into my story here, my first story, and it's really long. Apparently, it's 9 pages when Adam copy-pasted into a Word document. So strap on and prep yourselves for this ridiculously long story. There's a lot of dialogue, so hopefully you folks don't mind the voices, I guess.
You're really good at dialogue on these, though, so I'm excited for this.
Okay, cool. You know what? I was that kid that loved to read out loud in school, so, you know. I was watching a video today, a YouTube video by the Ghoul Boys, you know, at Watcher, and one of them was saying, like, you know, when people say, like, not to brag, but, and then add whatever, that's what I felt like just now, like, not to brag, but I like to read out loud in school. Okay. So
It's
anyway.
not really a brag as much as it is just like a, hey, here's a factoid about me.
Okay, cool. All right. So this story is called No End House. That's the one that I'm going to lead with. And it begins. Let me start by saying that Peter Terry was addicted to heroin. Good first sentence.
That's a solid first sentence to really draw you into a story. I'll say that.
We were friends in college and continued to be after I graduated. Notice that I said, I. He dropped out after 2 years of barely cutting it. After I moved out of the dorms and into a small apartment, I didn't see Peter as much. We would talk online every now and then. AIM was king in pre-Facebook years. Did you use AOL Instant Messenger?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we did.
Had a bunch of different quotes and different colors in my little profile that no one ever read.
There was a period where he wasn't online for about 5 weeks straight. I wasn't worried. He was a pretty notorious flake and drug addict, so I assumed he just stopped caring. Then one night, I saw him log on. Before I could initiate a conversation, he sent me a message. David, man, we need to talk. That was when he told me about the No End House. It got the name because no one had ever reached the final exit. The rules are pretty simple and cliche. Reach the final room of the building and you win $500. There were 9 rooms in total. The house was located outside the city, roughly 4 miles from my house. Apparently, Peter had tried and failed. He was a heroin and who knows what the fuck addict, so I figured the drugs got the best of him and he wigged out at a paper ghost or something. He told me it would be too much for anyone, that it was unnatural. I didn't believe him. I told him I would check it out the next night, and no matter how hard he tried to convince me otherwise, $500 sounded too good to be true.
Dollars.
Dollar bill, y'all. I had to go. I set out the following night. When I arrived, I immediately noticed something strange about the building. Have you ever seen or read something that shouldn't be scary, but for some reason a chill crawls up your spine? I walked toward the building, and the feeling of uneasiness only intensified as I opened the front door. My heart slowed, and I let a relieved sigh leave me as I entered. The room looked like a normal hotel lobby, decorated for Halloween. A sign was posted in place of a worker. It read, Room 1, this way. 8 more follow. Reach the end, and you win. I assume that's just what the sign's voice would sound like. Okay. I chuckled and made my way to the first door. The first area was almost laughable. The decor resembled the Halloween aisle of a Kmart, complete with sheet ghosts and animatronic zombies that gave a static growl when you passed by. At the far end...
Can I do the static growl?
Sure.
Rawr.
Is that staticky?
Nailed it.
At the far end was an exit. It was the only door besides the one that I'd entered through. I brushed through the fake spider webs and headed for the second room. I was greeted by a fog as I opened the door to room 2. The room definitely upped the ante in terms of technology. Not only was there a fog machine, but a bat hung from the ceiling and flew in a circle. Scary. They seemed to have a Halloween soundtrack that one would find in a 99-cent store on loop somewhere in the room. I didn't see a stereo, but I guessed that they must have used a PA system. I stepped over a few toy rats that wheeled around and walked with a puffed chest across to the next area. I reached for the doorknob and my heart sank to my knees. I did not want to open that door. A feeling of dread hit me so hard I could barely even think. Logic overtook me after a few terrified moments, and I shook it off and entered the next room. Room 3 is when things began to change. On the surface, it looked like a normal room. There was a chair in the middle of the wood-paneled floor. There was a single lamp in the corner, and it did a poor job of lighting the area, casting a few shadows across the floor and walls. That was the problem. Shadows. Plural. With the exception of the chairs, there were others. I'd barely walked in the door and I was already terrified. It was at that moment that I knew something wasn't right. I didn't even think as I automatically tried to open the door that I'd came through. It was locked from the other side. That set me off. Was someone locking the doors as I progressed? There's no way I would have heard them. Was it a mechanical lock that said automatically? Maybe, but I was too scared to really think. I turned back to the room and the shadows were gone. The chair shadow remained, but the others were gone. I slowly began to walk. I used to hallucinate when I was a kid. What the fuck? So I wrote off the shadows as a figment of my imagination.
I feel like that should be a symptom of a larger disorder, not just I used to hallucinate as a kid.
I began to feel better as I made it to the halfway point of the room. I looked down as I took my steps, and that's when I saw it. Or didn't see it. My shadow wasn't there. I didn't have time to scream. I just ran as fast as I could to the other door and flung myself without thinking into the room beyond. The fourth room was possibly the most disturbing. As I closed the door, all light seemed to be sucked out and put back into the previous room. I stood there, surrounded by darkness, not able to move. I'm not afraid of the dark and never have been, but I was absolutely terrified. All sight had left me. I held my hand in front of my face, and if I didn't know what I was doing, I would never have been able to tell. Darkness doesn't describe it. I couldn't hear anything. It was dead silence. When you're in a soundproof room, you can still hear yourself breathing. You can hear yourself being alive. I couldn't. I began to stumble forward after a few moments. My rapidly beating heart the only thing I could feel. There was no door in sight. Wasn't even sure there was one this time. The silence was then broken by a low hum. So you can't hear anything. You can't hear your heart beating at this point. You can just feel it. That's terrifying because I've been in a completely soundproof room and you can still hear yourself, you know?
It's very odd too because what you're usually hearing is the sound of your pulse in your ears.
Yeah.
Like it's not an actual sound emitting from your chest. So if you weren't able to hear that but you could still feel the pulse, yeah, that would be absolutely terrifying.
I felt something behind me. I spun around wildly but could barely even see my nose. I knew it was there, though. Regardless of how dark it was, I knew something was there. The hum grew louder, closer. It seemed to surround me, but I knew whatever was causing the noise was in front of me, inching closer, so I took a step back. I'd never felt that kind of fear. I can't really describe true fear. I wasn't even scared I was going to die. I was scared of what the alternative was. I was afraid of what this thing had in store for me. Then the lights flashed for a second. And I saw it. Nothing. I saw nothing, and I know I saw nothing there. The room again was plunged into darkness, and the hum became a wild screech. I screamed in protest. I couldn't hear this goddamn sound for another minute. I ran backwards, away from the noise, and fumbled for the door handle. I turned and fell into room 5. Before I describe room 5, you have to understand something. I am not a drug addict. You just have hallucinations, apparently.
Right.
But,
as a kid, I just had hallucinations. No big deal.
I've had no history of drug abuse or any sort of psychosis short of the childhood hallucinations I mentioned earlier. Okay. And those were only when I was really tired or just waking up. I entered the no-end house with a clear head. After falling in from the previous room, my view of room 5 was from my back, looking up at the ceiling. What I saw didn't scare me. It simply surprised me. Trees had grown into the room and towered above my head. The ceilings in this room were taller than the others, which made me think I was in a center of the house. I got up off the floor, dusted myself off, and took a look around. It was definitely the biggest room of all. I couldn't even see the door from where I was. Various brush and trees must have blocked my line of sight with the exit. Up to this point, I figured the rooms were going to get scarier. But this was paradise compared to the last room. I also assumed whatever was in room 4 stayed back there. I was incredibly wrong. I just imagined the predators in there because of all the trees, you know.
But you don't know what the predators sound like, as you have admitted to so far today.
Is it clicking? Okay. As I made my way deeper into the room, I began to hear what one would hear if they were in a forest. Chirping bugs, an occasional flap of birds, seemed to be the only company in the room. That was the thing that bothered me the most. I heard the bugs and the other animals, but I didn't see any of them. I began to wonder how big this house was. From the outside, when I first walked up to it, it looked like a regular house. It was definitely on the bigger side, but this was almost a full forest in here. The canopy covered my view of the ceiling, but I assumed it was still there, however high it was. I couldn't see any walls either. The only way I knew I was still inside was that the floor matched the other rooms. Dark, standard wood paneling. I kept walking, hoping that the next tray I passed would reveal the door. After a few moments of walking, I felt a mosquito fly onto my arm. I shook it off and kept going. A second later, I felt about 10 more land on my skin at different places. I felt them crawl up and down my arms and legs, and a few made their way across my face. I flailed wildly to get them all off, but they just kept crawling. I looked down and let out a muffled scream. More of a whimper, to be honest. I didn't see a single bug. Not one bug was on me, but I could feel them crawl. I heard them fly by my face and sting my skin, but I couldn't see a single one. I dropped to the ground and began to roll wildly. I was desperate. I hated bugs, especially ones I couldn't see or touch, but these bugs could touch me, and they were everywhere. I began to crawl. I had no idea where I was going. The entrance was nowhere in sight, and I still hadn't even seen the exit, so I just crawled, my skin wriggling with the presence of those phantom bugs. After what seemed like hours, I found the door. I grabbed the nearest tree, propped myself up, mindlessly slapping my arms and legs to no avail. I tried to run, but I couldn't. My body was exhausted from crawling and dealing with whatever it was that was on me. I took a few shaky steps to the door, grabbing each tree on the way for support. It was only a few feet away when I heard it, the low hum from before. It was coming from the next room, and it was deeper. I could almost feel it inside my body, like when you stand next to an amp at a concert. The feeling of the bugs on me lessened as the hum grew louder. As I placed my hand on the doorknob, the bugs were completely gone, but I couldn't bring myself to turn the knob. I knew that if I let go, the bugs would return, and there's no way I would make it back to room 4. I just stood there, my head pressed against the door marked 6, and my hand shakily grasping the knob. The hum was so loud I couldn't even hear myself pretend to think. There was nothing I could do but move on. Room 6 was next, and room 6 was hell. I closed the door behind me, my eyes held shut and my ears ringing. The hum was surrounding me. As the door clicked into place, the hum was gone. I opened my eyes in surprise, and the door I had shut was gone. It was just a wall now. I looked around in shock. The room was identical to room 3, the same chair and lamp, but with the correct amount of shadows this time. The only real difference was that there was no exit door. The one I came in through was gone. As I said before, I had no previous issues in terms of mental instability, but at that moment I fell into what I know was insanity. I didn't scream. I didn't make a sound. At first, I scratched softly. The wall was tough, but I knew the door was there somewhere. I just knew it. I scratched at where the doorknob was. I clawed at the wall, frantically, with both hands, my nails being filed down to the skin against the wood.
Jesus Christ.
I fell silently to my knees. The only sound in the room was the incessant scratching against the wall. I knew it was there. The door was there. I knew it was just there. I knew if I could just get past this wall. Are you all right? I jumped off the ground and spun in one motion. I leaned against the wall behind me and I saw what it was that spoke to me. To this day, I regret ever turning around. There was a little girl. She was wearing a soft, white dress that went down to her ankles. She had long blonde hair in the middle of her back and white skin and blue eyes. Blue eyes, white dragon. She was the most frightening thing I'd ever seen, and I know that nothing in my life will ever be as unnerving as what I saw in her. While looking at her, I saw something else. Where she stood, I saw what looked like a man's body, only larger than normal and covered in hair. He was naked from head to toe, but his head was not human and his toes were hooves. It wasn't the devil, but at that moment, it might as well have been. The form had the head of a ram and the snout of a wolf.
Sounds like a Trolloc for those of you who have read Wheel of Time.
It was horrifying, and it was synonymous with the little girl in front of me. They were the same form. I can't really describe it, but I saw them at the same time. They shared the same spot in that room, but it was like looking at two separate dimensions. When I saw the girl, I saw the form, and when I saw the form, I saw the girl. I couldn't speak. I could barely even see. My mind was revolting against what it was attempting to process. I had been scared before in my life, and I had never been more scared than when I was trapped in the 4th room. But that was before room 6. I just stood there, staring at whatever it was that spoke to me. There was no exit. I was trapped here with it. And then it spoke again. David, you should have listened. When it spoke, I heard the words of the little girl, but the other forms spoke through my mind in a voice I won't attempt to describe. There was no other sound. The voice just kept repeating that sentence over and over in my mind, and I agreed. I didn't know what to do. I was slipping into madness, yet couldn't take my eyes off what was in front of me. I dropped to the floor. I thought I'd passed out, but the room wouldn't let me. I just wanted it to end. I was on my side, my eyes wide open, and the form staring down at me. Scurrying across the floor in front of me was one of the battery-powered rats from the 2nd room. Okay, all right. The house was toying with me, but for some reason, seeing that rat pulled my mind back from whatever depths it was headed, and I looked around the room. I was getting out of there. I was determined to get out of that house and live and never think of this place again. I knew this room was hell, and I wasn't ready to take up a residency. At first, it was just my eyes that moved. I searched the walls for any kind of opening. The room wasn't that big, so it didn't take long to soak up the entire layout. The demon still taunted me, the voice growing louder as the form stayed rooted where it stood. I placed my hand on the floor, lifted myself up to all fours, and turned to scan the wall behind me. Then I saw something that I couldn't believe. The form was now right at my back, whispering into my mind how I shouldn't have come. I felt its breath on the back of my neck, but I refused to turn around. A large rectangle was scratched into the wood with a small dent chipped away in the center of it. Right in front of my eyes, I saw the large 7 I had mindlessly etched into the wall. I knew what it was. Room 7 was just beyond that wall where room 5 was moments ago. I don't know how I'd done it. Maybe it was just my state of mind at the time, but I had created the door. I knew I had. In my mindness, I'd scratched into the wall what I needed the most, an exit to the next room. Room 7 was close. I knew the demon was right behind me, but for some reason it couldn't touch me. I closed my eyes and placed both hands on the large 7 in front of me. I pushed. I pushed as hard as I could. The demon was now screaming in my ear. It told me I was never leaving. It told me that this was the end, but I wasn't going to die. I was going to live there in room 6 with it. I wasn't. I pushed and screamed at the top of my lungs. I knew I was going to push through the wall eventually. I clenched my eyes and screamed, and the demon was gone. I was left in silence. I turned around slowly and was greeted by the room as it was when I entered. Just a chair and a lamp. I couldn't believe it, but I didn't have time to dwell. I turned back to the 7 and jumped back slightly. What I saw was a door. It wasn't the one I'd scratched in, but a regular door with a large 7 on it. My whole body was shaking. It took me a while to turn the knob. I just stood there for a while, staring at this door. I couldn't stay in room 6. I just couldn't. But if this was only room 6, I couldn't imagine what 7 had in store. I must have stood there for an hour just staring at that 7. Finally, with a deep breath, I twisted the knob and opened the door to room 7. I stumbled through the door, mentally exhausted and physically weak. The door behind me closed, and I realized where I was. I was outside. Not outside like room 5, but actually outside. My eyes stung. I wanted to cry. I fell to my knees and tried, but I couldn't. I was finally out of that hell. I didn't even care about the fries.
How dare you always care about fries.
Sounds fucking delicious right now. I didn't even care about the prize that was promised. I turned and saw that the door I just went through was the entrance. I walked to my car and drove home, thinking of how nice a shower sounded. As I pulled up to the house, I felt uneasy. The joy of leaving No End House had faded, and dread was slowly building in my stomach. I shook it off as a residual from the house and made my way to the front door. I entered and immediately went up to my room. There, on my bed, was my cat, Baskerville. Cute. He was the first living thing I'd seen all night and reached to pet him. He hissed and swiped at my hand. I recoiled in shock as he'd never acted like that. I thought, whatever, he's an old cat. I jumped in the shower and got ready for what I was expecting to be a sleepless night. After my shower, I went to the kitchen to make something to eat. I descended the stairs and turned into the family room. What I saw would be forever burned into my mind, however. My parents were lying on the ground, naked and covered in blood. They were mutilated to near unidentifiable states. Their limbs were removed and placed next to their bodies. Jesus Christ.
This is super gross.
And their heads were placed on their chests, facing me. The most unsettling part was their expressions, not the fucking mutilation.
Yeah, apparently having their limbs ripped out wasn't the most unsettling part.
They were smiling as though they were happy to see me. I vomited and sobbed there in the family room. I didn't know what had happened. They didn't even live with me at the time. I was a mess. Then I saw it. A door that was never there before.
Go through it really quick.
A door with a large 8 scrawled on it in blood.
All this for $500, mind you. Like
$500 dues.
I've been in certain points in my life where $500 was a ton of money, but it's not enough for this. This is nonsense.
I was still in the house. I was standing in my family room, but I was in room 7. The faces of my parents smiled wider as I realized this. They weren't my parents. They couldn't be. But they looked exactly like them. The door marked 8 was across the room, behind the mutilated bodies in front of me. I knew I had to move on, but at that moment, I gave up. The smiling faces tore into my mind. They grounded me where I stood. I vomited again and nearly collapsed. Then the hum returned. It was louder than ever, and it filled the house and shook the walls. The hum compelled me to walk. I began to walk slowly, making my way closer to the door and the bodies. I could barely stand, let alone walk, and the closer I got to my parents, the closer I came to suicide. The walls were now shaking so hard it seemed as though they were going to crumble, but still the faces smiled at me. As I inched closer, their eyes followed me. I was now between the 2 bodies, a few feet away from the door. The dismembered hands clawed their way across the carpet towards me, all while the faces continued to stare. New terror washed over me, and I walked faster. I didn't want to hear them speak. I didn't want the voices to match those of my parents. They began to open their mouths, and the hands were inches from my feet. In a dash of desperation, I lunged towards the door, threw it open, and slammed it behind me. Room 8. I was done. After what I'd just experienced, I knew there wasn't anything else in this fucking house that could be thrown at me that I couldn't live through. There was nothing short of the fires of hell that I wasn't ready for. Unfortunately, I underestimated the abilities of No End House. Unfortunately, things got more disturbing, more terrifying, and more unspeakable in Room 8. I still have trouble believing what I saw in Room 8. Again, the room was a carbon copy of Rooms 3 and 6, but sitting in the usually empty chair was a man. After a few seconds of disbelief, my mind finally accepted the fact that the man sitting in the chair was me. Not someone who looked like me. It was David Williams. I walked closer. I had to get a better look, even though I was sure of it. He looked up at me, and I noticed tears in his eyes. Please don't do it. Please don't hurt me. What? I asked. Who are you? I'm not going to hurt you. Yes, you are. He was sobbing now. You're going to hurt me, and I don't want you to. He sat in the chair with his legs up and began rocking back and forth. It was actually pretty pathetic looking, especially since he was me, identical in every way. Listen, who are you? I was now only a few feet from my doppelganger. It was the weirdest experience yet, standing there, talking to myself. I wasn't scared, but I would be soon. Why are you... You're going to hurt me. You're going to hurt me. If you want to leave, you're going to hurt me. Why are you saying this? Just calm down, all right? Let's try and figure this out. And then I saw it. The David sitting down was wearing the same clothes as me, except for a small red patch on his shirt embroidered with the number 9.
Gross.
You're going to hurt me. You're going to hurt me. Please don't. You're going to hurt me. My eyes didn't leave that small number on his chest. I knew exactly what it was. The first few doors were plain and simple, but after a while, they got a little more ambiguous. 7 was scratched into the wall, but by my own hands. 8 was marked in blood above the bodies of my parents, but 9? This number was on a person, a living person. Worse still, it was on a person that looked exactly like me. David? I had to ask. Yes, you're going to hurt me. You're going to hurt me, he continued to sob and rock. He answered to David. He was me, right down to the voice. But that 9! I paced around for a few minutes while he sobbed in his chair. The room had no door, and similar to room 6, the door I came through was gone. For some reason, I assumed that scratching would get me nowhere this time. I studied the walls and the floor around the chair, sticking my head underneath and seeing if anything was below. Unfortunately, there was. Below the chair was a knife. Attached was a tag that read, "To David, from management." The feeling in my stomach as I read that tag was something sinister. I wanted to throw up, and the last thing I wanted to do was remove that knife from under that chair. The other David was still sobbing uncontrollably. My mind was spinning into an attic of unanswerable questions. Who put this here? Obviously management. And how did they get my name? Obviously management. Not to mention the fact that as I knelt on the cold wood floor, I also sat in that chair, sobbing in protest of being hurt by myself. It was all too much to process. The house and the management had been playing with me this whole time. My thoughts for some reason turned to Peter and whether or not he got this far. If he did, if he met a Peter Terry, sobbing in this very chair, rocking back and forth. I shook those thoughts out of my head. They didn't matter. I took the knife from under the chair and immediately the other David went quiet. "David," he said in my voice, "what do you think you're going to do?" I lifted myself from the ground and clenched the knife in my hand. "I'm going to get out of here." David was still sitting in the chair, though he's very calm now. He looked up at me with a slight grin. I couldn't tell if he was going to laugh or strangle me. Slowly, he got up from the chair and stood facing me. It was uncanny. His height and even the way he stood matched mine. I felt the rubber hilt of the knife in my hand and gripped it tighter. I didn't know what I was planning on doing with it, but I had a feeling I was going to need it. "Now," his voice was slightly deeper than my own, "I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to hurt you, and I'm going to keep you here." I didn't respond. I just lunged and tackled him to the ground. I had mounted him and looked down, knife poised and ready. He looked up at me terrified. It was like I was looking in a mirror. Then the hum returned, low and distant, though I still felt it deep in my body. David looked up at me as I looked down at myself. The hum was getting louder and I felt something inside me snap. With one motion, I slammed the knife into the patch on his chest and ripped down. Blackness fell on the room, and I was falling. The darkness around me was like nothing I had experienced up to that point. Room 4 was dark, but it didn't come close to what was completely engulfing me. I wasn't even sure if I was falling after a while. I felt weightless, covered in dark. Then a deep sadness came over me. I felt lost, depressed, and suicidal. The thought of my parents entered my mind. I knew it wasn't real, but I'd seen it, and the mind has trouble differentiating between what is real and what isn't. The sadness only deepened. I was in room 9 for what seemed like days. The final room. And that's exactly what it was. The end. No End House had an end, and I had reached it. At that moment, I gave up. I knew I'd be in that in-between state forever, accompanied by nothing but darkness. Not even the hum was there to keep me sane. I had lost all senses. I couldn't feel myself. I couldn't hear anything. Sight was completely useless here. I searched for a taste in my mouth and found nothing. I felt disembodied and completely lost. I knew where I was. This was hell. Room 9 was hell. I mean, you said that about a room before. Then it happened. A light. One of those stereotypical lights at the end of the tunnel. I felt the ground come up from below, and I was standing. After a moment or two of gathering my thoughts and senses, I slowly walked towards that light. As I approached the light, it took form. It was a vertical slit down the side of an unmarked door. I slowly walked through the door and found myself back where I started. The lobby of No End House. It was exactly how I left it. Still empty, still decorated with childish Halloween decorations. After everything that had happened that night, I was still wary of where I was. After a few moments of normalcy, I looked around the place trying to find anything different. On the desk was a plain white envelope with my name handwritten on it. Immensely curious, yet still cautious, I mustered up the courage to open the envelope. Inside was a letter. Again, handwritten. David Williams, congratulations! You have made it to the end of No End House. Please accept this prize as a token of great achievement. Yours forever, Management. With the letter were 5 $100 bills.
Yeah, easy money.
I couldn't stop laughing. I laughed for what seemed like hours. I laughed as I walked out to my car and laughed as I drove home. I laughed as I pulled into the driveway. I laughed as I opened my front door to my house, and I laughed as I saw the small 10 etched into the wood.
Bummer.
And that's the end of the story.
So No End House truly has no end.
No End House has no end.
Or maybe what it's really trying to say is that the world that we live in is the most horrific thing of all, and that he's just going to keep doing it. It's
maybe
kind of crazy, always trading, your hours for dollars just so you can stay alive. Like, what is worse than that? Lots of things, by the way.
Lots of things, but there's got to be a reason why his house is number 10. He leaves No End House. They're like, here's $500.
I don't think he actually leaves. I think he's just still in room 9 until he gets home with the money, and then he moves into room 10, and it's just like some new sort of hell that's going to await him. Because it's No End House. He's stuck in the house with no end. So,
well, that's true.
Either way, that was as good as it was long.
It was very long. My throat hurts.
Solid stuff, Robin. Good story. Thank you for that. And we're only 2 of the 4 stories deep now, making me wonder whether or not we should even have Robin read a second story, since my next one is pretty long.
Yeah, we can. We can totally save my other story for a different episode.
We'll see how long my next one takes, because it's not nearly as long as yours, but it is long. So, either way, good story.
Yeah, thanks.
So before we move into our next story, we are going to take a really quick commercial break. And we're back. So let's go ahead and move into the next story of the show. This one's title is World's Best School Psychologist. I also read this one, and this one doesn't exactly have a twist ending, but it has a twist, and it gets a little bit crazy here, so strap on. Starts out like this. When I was 12, I came to the conclusion that everyone in the world, including my own family, was against me. I was never a problem child, but my parents sure treated me like one. For example, I used to need to be home by 5 p.m. every day. This clearly restricted my amount of playtime outdoors.
Sounds hot.
Does it? For a 12-year-old to have playtime? Weird.
Outdoors. The sun is fucking hot.
Outsource.
The sun is hot. Just saying. It was fucking almost 100 today.
I wasn't allowed to have friends over to play at the house, nor was I allowed to go over to anyone else's. I had to finish homework directly after I came home from school, no matter how long it took. My parents refused to buy me video games and forced me to read books and then write a book report to them that I actually read it. I will say, that sounds strict. It doesn't sound like they're out to get you. Now, even though those rules listed above were quite frustrating to me as a child, they aren't what upset me most. What really hurt me was the lack of compassion on behalf of my parents. My mother was a bitter woman who always made me feel guilty about accidents or mistakes I made. My father only knew one emotion, frustration. The only time he spoke to me was when he screamed at me for receiving poor test scores or beat me for misbehaving.
Is this about Asians?
I was going to say, this sounds like my life growing up. But enough about them. Let's talk about my school psychologist. I'm just kidding. My mom wasn't like that. For his own privacy.
Like your dad?
Shut up. It's unsaid. Let's keep going. For his own privacy, we will call him Dr. Tanner. Like most junior high schools, a psychologist is always available on campus during school hours to assist any students in need of counseling, whether it is emotional, academic, social, behavioral, etc. To be honest, I have never seen any students talking with Dr. Tanner. Every day, I would walk past his office on my way to the cafeteria and peek through his door's little window. He would always be alone in there working on some paperwork. I guess that most kids were too afraid to speak about their problems to an adult who is practically a stranger. For this reason, it took me 3 weeks to muster enough courage to go into his office. March 2nd, 1993 was the day I decided to voice my troubles to Dr. Tanner. During lunch break, I stood in front of his office door and knocked. Through the window, I could see him raise his head, smile, and motion for me to come in. I did.
He eats the children.
I'm glad you didn't predict the twist, but I would have been really pissed if he actually, yes, like I said before the story started, I read this one already. He greeted me by introducing himself and asking for my name. Dr. Tanner was a very soft-spoken man who seemed to radiate kindness. In less than 30 minutes, I rambled to Dr. Tanner about how mean my parents were to me and how they didn't care about me at all. After a while, my voice began to quiver and I stopped speaking. The psychologist listened patiently to my whole spiel, arms folded and head nodding. I half expected him to begin talking about how everything I had just said was untrue and that my parents loved me dearly and blah, 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 blah. It literally says that in the story. But he didn't. Dr. Tanner leaned towards me with a grin on his face and said, "You know, I'm the best school psychologist in the world. I promise we will fix this."
Oh my God.
I rolled my eyes. "Okay, but how?" I asked. "I have my ways," he replied. "I'm a man of my word. I promise that within just 1 month, the relationship between you and your parents will change for the better forever." After a brief pause, he continued, "Although I do need you to make me a promise. You have to promise that you'll come back to my office after school tomorrow and that you won't tell anyone we had this conversation today. It'll be our little secret."
No.
That phrase, by the way, is the one thing that is the biggest red flag in the world if said to a 12-year-old by an adult.
Don't tell anybody we met today. It's our little secret.
Anyone says it'll be our little secret, you run.
Yes.
The story continues. I promise.
So stupid.
Yep.
So dumb. There's actually, so there's an episode of Buffy where Adam rolls his eyes, but there's an episode of Buffy where Dawn, right, is super upset because she feels like no one pays attention to her. That's why she's a little fucking...
Maybe she felt all the hate that would be generated by the audience towards her character for the next foreseeable 153,000 years. Who knows?
She's a fucking little kleptomaniac.
Poor Michelle Trachtenberg.
She's a monster in that show. Hate her. And she goes to the school counselor or psychologist, whatever, to talk about her issues. The school counselor happens to be a fucking demon, a wish demon. And Dawn says, I wish everybody was stuck and couldn't leave me. And so, wish granted. And that's the episode where they all get trapped in the house and they can't leave. Do you remember that episode?
No, I don't really.
But yeah, this gives me those vibes.
That's not how this is going to turn out. I'll tell you that. This is better than that episode.
You don't even remember that episode.
You just told me they all get trapped in a house, and I'm telling you this is better than that. All right, continuing on. The following day, I returned to Dr. Tanner after school. It was around 4 p.m. when I entered his office. After a warm welcome, he asked me to have a seat in front of his desk once again. Upon sitting down, I watched Dr. Tanner close the blinds of the door's tiny window.
No.
There, he smiled.
Okay, this is already a creepypasta because he's a fucking creep.
Now we have all the privacy we need.
No.
We began to talk about my likes and interests, my favorite subjects in school, my least favorite school teachers, and things of the like. About an hour into the conversation, Dr. Tanner offered me a soft drink.
No.
I gladly took the offer, considering my parents never allowed me to drink soda. Dr. Tanner reached over to his mini fridge and fidgeted around before setting down 2 open cans of soda on the desk.
No.
Afterwards, we continued to talk about what was going on in my life, and it wasn't long before I passed out from whatever drugs Dr. Tanner placed in my drink. Then it has, a bunch of dots as an intermission, and then it skips ahead. It took me a minute or so to adjust my blurred vision upon waking, and when it did, I had no idea what to think. I was handcuffed to a bed and my mouth was sealed with duct tape. I immediately began panic squirming and tugging at the cuffs, but gave up soon after. My eyes widened in disbelief after looking around the room. There were posters of superheroes pinned up along the walls and photographs of famous athletes on shelves. In the middle of the room was an old television and Super Nintendo, various game cartridges stacked alongside it. Side note, I will say that Super Nintendo was brand new in 1993.
Is this 1993?
Yes.
Okay.
I didn't know what to think. Here I am in a room filled with the items most kids would die to play with. I would have probably cried from joy hadn't I been handcuffed to a bed frame.
This sounds like this really happened to someone.
My stomach sank once again as the door opened and Dr. Tanner walked inside. He sat down on the edge of the bed. Now listen, he said. Remember that I'm here to help you and I would never hurt you, okay? Dr. Tanner gently removed the tape from my mouth and then the cuffs from my hands. My first instinct was to begin crying, but something about Dr. Tanner made me feel safe. He smiled at me. I don't think there's anything someone could do to make me feel safe if they drugged me and handcuffed me to a bed.
Yep.
He smiled at me. You're going to be staying here for a while, he continued. And during this time, you're allowed to play with any toys in this room while I'm here at home. But when I leave the house, I'll need to cuff one of your hands back to the bed. You can still watch the television, but I want you to only watch the news channels when I'm away. I sat in silence, still trying to process the information he had given me. So, Dr. Tanner yipped, slapping me on the knee. You go ahead and knock yourself out. I'll be back when it's time for dinner. He got up from the bed, walked across the room, and clicked the TV's power button before locking the door behind him. Several more minutes passed before I realized that Dr. Tanner wasn't joking. All that was left for me to do was boot up the Nintendo and play Mario until nightfall. You really should have been playing Link to the Past. At about
Was it out in 1993?
I don't know, actually. That's a good question. But if it's Super Nintendo, I'm playing Link to the Past. At about 7 p.m., Dr. Tanner returned to the room carrying 2 plates of mashed potatoes and chicken strips. I finally gathered up the courage to ask him how long I'd be staying in this room. Well, about a month, he replied. Give or take a few weeks. I just have some work that I need to do. Then it gives you, like, the dots again to let you know time's passed. And now Robin's going to tell us another episode of Buffy.
No, I'm just thinking, so is this guy's plan like, I'm just going to keep you here for a month, your parents are going to freak out, and then when they get you back, because I will give you back, their relationship will be better than ever because the parents will be like, oh, thank God you're alive.
I don't know. I guess we're going to have to wait and see how it unfolds, huh? I hate you.
Did I guess it?
Kind of.
Hell fucking yeah.
Thanks for ruining all my stories.
Sorry.
Always. Also, there's something way crazier at the end of this story.
Oh, Lord have mercy.
The following morning, I awoke to Dr. Tanner's hand patting my head. Hey, bud, you don't have to wake up right now if you don't want to, but I am going to need to put this back on, he whispered, clamping the cold, steel handcuff onto my wrist. I gazed up at him. He was wearing a collared shirt and slacks, a coat draped over his shoulder, and a suitcase at his side. He looked just how he always did when I saw him around school. Before leaving, he placed the TV's remote next to me and told me to turn it on and watch the news. The first thing I saw upon turning it on was a breaking news segment. An important-looking police officer stood at a podium surrounded by people with microphones. I happened to begin viewing halfway through his speech. And now it's like the quotations of what this guy was saying. A statewide Amber Alert has been issued as of this morning. We have several investigators working towards identifying potential abductors, but as of right now, there is not much evidence. Faculty members state that the boy had last been seen around 4 or 5 in the evening on... And it says, I began to feel nauseous as a photograph of me appeared on the screen. It was my yearbook picture from last year. Captions for the photograph displayed my name and age, my school, and my town. Above my picture were alternating titles. FBI begins search for child, and kidnapping suspect unknown, and potential runaway. The live footage continued in 2 figures I soon recognized as my mom and dad stepped up to the podium. Both appeared to have reddened eyes. Tears streamed down my mother's face as she took hold of a microphone. I'd never seen so much emotion come from my mother before as she wept on live television, stuttering on sentences such as, please return my baby back to me, and I'm so sorry, and please come home to us. When my father took the microphone, I nearly expected his attitude to be stone cold, but he too had tears in his eyes. He pleaded to the world to bring his son home safely and lastly begged for my forgiveness. I know I haven't been the best father, but goddammit, I do wish I had been now. Please bring my boy back. I turned the power off shortly after. My emotions were mixed, for I had never once seen my father cry. I felt miserable that my parents were being put through so much, but at the same time, I felt relief. I now know how much mom and dad love me. Time lapse. Nearly 4 weeks have passed, and Dr. Tanner has been treating me with the utmost respect.
Aw, okay.
He leaves me in the morning cuffed to the bed frame, but returns in the afternoon to eat lunch and dinner with me, talk, and play games. I never would have guessed how good Dr. Tanner was at Monopoly and Scrabble.
You're 12.
You're fucking 12, dog.
Like,
you just cheat. You say you're going to be the banker because no one wants to be the banker, and then you steal the 500 and you fucking decimate people.
what?
I don't do that. Just for the record, that's what adults do to kids. All right, moving on.
I have never done that to a child.
Well, you don't play with enough kids. But one morning when Dr. Tanner woke me before heading off to work, I noticed a stern look on his face. I also realized that it was 3 hours earlier than he usually wakes me. You need to watch the news today. No exceptions. I want you to keep the television on all day and pay close attention to it, he stated grimly. I, of course, complied and watched him exit the room. About 2 hours later, a breaking news segment interrupted the toothpaste commercial I was watching. The title of the segment was, Human remains found. Two staunch-looking men in suits stood aside one another and began speaking. Quote, "We are displeased to bring up such unfortunate news this morning regarding our missing child case from earlier this month." One of the men bowed his head, while the one speaking shuffled through some papers and continued. "Remains of a body have been found in a garbage bag beneath a highway overpass. The body appears to be that of a child, although not much is left of it. The body has been decapitated and much has been burnt to ash and bone." The screen shifted over to a helicopter view of the freeway, and dozens of police cars gathered near the bottom of a tall overpass. The man's voice could still be heard. Within the bag, police found a junior high school identification card labeled as such. The screen showed the school ID card I always kept in my backpack. The plastic was sort of melted away, but my photograph and name were intact. After the two men dismissed themselves, the camera panned over to my parents. They were sitting among reporters. My mother's face held a painful grimace, and my father sulked his head down at his knees. I shut the television off. Dr. Tanner returned home very late. He hurried into the room, unlocked my cuffs, and placed a bottle of fizzing water into my hands. He placed his hands on my shoulders and smiled. "I made you a promise, didn't I?" I nodded, tears squeezing their way out of my eyes. "You need to make me a promise again," he whispered. He told me that I needed to drink all of the water in the bottle. It would help me sleep. And that from here on, I am never to tell anyone that I ever met him. I promised. "I told you. I'm the best psychologist in the world, didn't I?" And he was right. I awoke later that night to find myself lying in the middle of a park, stars shining brilliantly across the night sky. I recognized the park. It wasn't too far from my school. A mile or so down the road, I saw my house. The lights were off inside, but I could make out my father sitting on the step leading to the front door. I hesitantly called out to him. He lifted his head slowly, but when he saw it was me, he sprang to his feet, ran towards me, arms open, yelling my name. My mother erupted from the house behind him. Dr. Tanner was right. Things have changed with my family and I. My parents smile more often and treat me lovingly. I could not ask for a more perfect ending. Every now and then I see Dr. Tanner on campus, walking to and from his office. Rarely do we ever make eye contact, let alone speak to one another, but sometimes he'll shoot me a wink and a smile. I always keep my promise to him and I pretend I've never met him, but there will always be one question floating through my mind. Who did Dr. Tanner decapitate and throw off the overpass?
Some random fucking kid, dude. That's messed up. But
Poor kid.
That's like some true crime horror right there.
Yeah, this one was like just creepy enough for me to be like, this could be real in some horrible confession way. And it was just like, I was reading through it like, okay, I have a feeling how this is going to end. So when I got to the end, I was like, oh, he killed someone. Like, yeah, that's really fucked up.
He killed a kid, too. It wasn't just someone. It was a freaking child.
Yeah. So, yeah, that was my second, and I think the last story
Thanks for that,
of the
horror.
show. You're welcome. That's what you get for trying to predict my shit. So.
Winning.
So, I want to thank everyone who listened to this episode of Pastatime with the Scariest podcast. It was definitely very fun.
Pastatime with a big old pop.
Cool.
Popstatime.
Popstatime with the Scariest podcast. If you have a creepypasta or an SCP that you have read, you think is cool, and you think you would like us to read it, just send it our way. You can tweet at us. You can hit us up on any of the different ways you can. You can hit us up on Facebook, facebook.com/scarishpodcast. Twitter is @scarishpod. Instagram is @scarishpodcast. If you want to email us, storytime@scarishpodcast is the email that we use for actual events that have happened to folks. So if you have a story you'd like to send our way, do that. If you have your own story, if you have a short story that you have written that is fictional, that is in the horror genre, like creepypasta-ish, send it our way if you would like us to read it on the air. Pastatime@scarish.com is where we get those. Also, you can go to our website, scarish.com, fill out that form. That comes directly to us. Robin, for folks who would like to donate to us, how can they do so?
You can go to patreon.com/scarishpodcast, and those are monthly donations. Tier start $1 at $1 to get ad-free episodes, and you can't really go wrong with ad-free. There's physical merch tiers and stuff on there too. If you're not into the whole monthly donation subscription type thing, you can go to ko-fi.com/scarishpodcast. All of your donations go to upgrading studio setup and kind of keep us going and motivated and things like that. Also, I want to let everybody know that starting June 1st, I believe, my Etsy shop is going to have free international shipping over a certain dollar amount. I think it's 50 or 75, one of those. So if you were looking at stuff and you're an international spooky friend, You can go starting June. If you purchase a certain amount, then you get free international shipping, which is great for you. I know international shipping can get really expensive from the US. So I thought I'd let you know.
Indeed. That's everything we have for this episode of Pastatime number 8. So, Robin, why don't you go ahead and send us out?
Keep on creeping on, and we'll talk to you guys later.
Bye.